Welcome. Are there people online at this moment coming in? And I'd invite you to do the same thing with Sandy in the chat to be able to talk a little bit about who you are, how many kids in the Sunday school, and how this is leaving you feeling these days. I'll start in about 4 minutes. Is that okay? If you want to rush, I understand there's cookies and drinks up on the next floor, and bring them on down. Third floor, 2 escalator rides for cookies and drinks. I'm going to give you about 10 or 15 more seconds to finish up. Buenos tardes, and welcome to our workshop this afternoon. I am thankful that you're here, just with being the last workshop on the second day of all those workshops, and I know that you're tired and such, so I'm very, very grateful that you are here. I should also say that not only are we here in this room, we also have an online presence. We have a number of people attending online with us today as well, and I need to say thank you very much to Sandy, who's managing our online Zoom presence, and she will be hearing questions from people who are online and will let me know what those questions are, and we'll be passing on comments to them. We are also thrilled to be welcoming people from other places, from Puerto Rico and from, I can't remember, who are here participating in our workshop with Spanish translation. And so I need to be reminded to talk slow because I'm a Canadian and I talk fast, so I need to slow down. But I am very, very grateful that you are all here today and interested in this topic. One of the things I need to let you know before we get started is because we have an online presence and a translation presence, this workshop is being recorded, and it will be put on the APCE website probably a week or two after this event. All the handouts, there's only two, that go along with this workshop will also be put up on the APCE website. So if you are sick and tired of taking notes and just want to sit back and relax, you can go and do that and see it all again in another few weeks and look at it anytime you want. Having said you don't have to take any notes, I also want to point out to you what the handouts are on your table, because I'm not really going to refer to them much after this moment in time. The first one that you'll see on your table is really just a sheet to take notes on. If something strikes you and you want to put it in there, these are the 6 best practices that we're going to look at today. But if you just want to jog in the blank spaces something that jumps out at you, feel free. If you want to put it back in the middle of the table and pretend it never existed, that's okay too. The other handout that we have is a bibliography. I may refer throughout this workshop to 1 or 2 books on this bibliography, but this is a bibliography that I work with as I'm looking at these best practices and as I was beginning to consolidate these best practices. There's some at the beginning that are theory that cross over everything, and some that are more pointed towards the individual practices that we're going to talk about today. So you can just set those aside if you want. If I mention something you want to highlight it, feel free, but there it is. So let me begin by introducing myself. My name is Tori Smit, and I serve as the Regional Minister for Faith Formation for the Synod of Central Northeastern Ontario and Bermuda. This is when you say Bermuda, and I go, yes, that Bermuda. For the Presbyterian Church in Canada. We actually have a congregation in Bermuda, and I serve there. And I serve basically as a consultant to 262 congregations within our synod, helping them and assisting them in any way possible I can in the areas of Christian education and faith formation. And so that's what I do every day of the week. So I want to start with a little story that comes from my synod. And so when I started this job, started in 2012 serving in this synod, I would start getting phone calls from places all over my synod, from north and south and east and west. And just about the most common phone call I got, usually 2, maybe 3 times a week, the phone call would begin, and the first words that would come out of the mouth of the person who was phoning me were the words, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry to bother you." And then they would say, "We have very, very few children in our Sunday school. We have 3 or we have 5. And they would apologize once again as if they had no right to even call me when they had so few children. And they would say, "I'm calling today because of the number of children that we have. Could you please recommend a Sunday school curriculum that would work well with so few children?" And then they would begin to tell the story. They would talk about how it was that their teachers were feeling deflated, exhausted. It was impossible to get teachers. That often the teachers would be preparing lesson plans during the week before that Sunday, and then they would come to church and they would discover that there were no kids that Sunday in church. And they would throw that well-planned Sunday school lesson in the garbage. So they said, could you please recommend a Sunday school curriculum that isn't dated? Because we're tired of throwing Sunday school lessons in the garbage. The other thing that they would talk about was how difficult it was to actually work with that Sunday school curriculum. That they asked for dramas with 15 children and games with another 20 children. All sorts of activities that had no idea that they were impossible in their situation. They would also talk about wanting a lesson that was easy to plan, because their Sunday school teachers had gotten to the point that they were now planning lessons on the way down the stairs after the children's story. And so if it could be planned in about 20 stairs, that would be great. And then they would say, and if it was free, that would be great as well. And so I would answer their question. We would begin to talk about things like broadly graded curriculum or ways in which there were some things off the internet that they could download that were quite simplified. We could talk about what was important in their Sunday school class. And then I would hang up. And as I hung up the phone, I would wish that they would stop calling me and asking, what is a good curriculum to use with so few children? What I really wanted them to ask me is, what is the best that we can do with faith formation with the children of our church, given the fact that we have so few children? I wanted a bigger conversation about how children grow in faith and how they are transformed in faith, and how we can do that in the context of churches with very, very few children. And so nobody asked me that question, but I decided to go about trying to figure out the answer to it, just in case somebody would ask me one day. Or if you're more like me, I would just tell them the answer before they asked the question in the first place. I wanted, first of all, to begin to look at what is the best that we can do in faith formation in and of itself. What do we know in recent research? What have we discovered recently? How is it that children come to faith? Not only faith as children, but how do they actually grow in faith and continue to be adults of faith? I wanted to figure that one out. And so I decided the first thing that I was going to do was I was going to begin to look at that question. What is the best that we can do for faith formation with children, regardless of the size of our church? And then I would begin to look at what of these practices lend themselves well? What of these practices are actually best and well suited for churches with very few children? So that's what I set myself about doing. In the middle of this, is that little cursor there? In the middle of this, I went to a conference. And I ran into a friend of mine who I hadn't seen in many, many years. We went to school together when we were studying to be diaconal ministers or Christian educators, and she had just retired. And so we were sitting outside the conference hall and having a chat, and I said to her, "What have you done in your retirement?" And her answer came back that she had planted an orchard. On her property, she'd planted an orchard. And then she said, "I may never see the fruit of that orchard, but I planted it for my grandchildren." And that stuck with me. I went home from that conference and I just kept turning it over and over and over in my head. What if in the church we were to plant orchards with no guarantee that we may see the fruit of that orchard, but that we plant it anyway? We plant it for our children and we plant it for our grandchildren. So I added one more layer to my question. Not only what is the best that we can do in faith formation for children in churches with 10 or fewer children, but it needed to be fruitful and it needed to be sustainable. Not for an instant hit that would get us some great thing going on for the summer and then it would all go right back to where it was before. But what is it that is fruitful and sustainable? Sustainable by churches that are often exhausted. Perhaps they have few adults. I actually worked with some churches with 10 or few children that had more than 500 adults, actually, when I was doing this work. But what is it that we can do that is for the long haul and not for the immediate hit? So my question, what are the best practices for ministry with children in congregations with 10 or fewer children? I started doing some reading. The first book I looked at was Christian Education in a Small Membership Church. It's a rather old book. I didn't actually get tons of stuff out of this book, but I got this piece out of this book, and this is another one that stuck with me. In her book, Karen Ty says, with only half a dozen kids and youth, 100% participation does still not create a viable education program if we rely on traditional models of age-segregated classes. That's what jumped out at me. If we rely on traditional models of age-segregated classes, that meant that I could wipe that off the table, and that didn't have to be there anymore, and I could imagine anything I pleased. It was a freeing, amazing moment to read that, to know that doing it the way we've always done it, doing it the way the big churches do it, didn't matter. We could just go ahead and do something else. So then I started looking at a couple of other books. This book, Children's Ministry in the Way of Jesus, by David Chinosh and Ivy Beckwith, this is a much more recent book. And in this book, they weren't talking so much about few children, but what they were talking about doing children's ministry differently. They never really talked much in this book about Sunday school. What they actually started talking about in a postmodern world, what is it that children need from us? How is it that we as a church serve the children of our church? And they said that it's about serving children, caring for them, and forming them into people who serve one another and the world in the way of Jesus. They then went on to say that this ministry needs to be active and meaningful. It needs to have active and meaningful participants, great theological conversations with children that enter into conversation about their questions, which are taken seriously, and that we need to link arms with young disciples to work for justice and care in the world. All of this was a fantastic launching point for me to begin to figure out what it is we ought to be doing in these churches with very few children. And so we come to 6 best practices that I came along. All of them are best practices for churches with as many children as we might have. It's not that this is just for churches with few children, but these are the ones that I found churches needed to think about. Churches needed to enter into a conversation about. My first one was to provide meaningful participation in intergenerational worship. This was huge for me. I come from Canada, and in Canada, I don't know about your church, but in Canada, pretty much all of the churches in my denomination, the children are in church for the first 15 minutes. They're by and large ignored for the first 10. They're given a 5-minute children's story, and then they're prayed with and for and invited to go downstairs to the Sunday school. Children in my church, by and large, are not participants in worship in any way at all. And so the first one, to provide meaningful participation in intergenerational worship, not just to have worship that has all ages present in it, but how is it that we involve all ages in worship, and how do those people interact with one another, not just sit in the pew facing forward? And so I began to do this. I want to put a few background pieces together that go with that first, though. A couple of things that people have said. For children to participate in the life of the faith community, they need to be present for all the central practices of the community. And in our world, worship is the central practice of our community. And if our children are not present with us in worship, truly present with us in worship, then our body is not complete. We're not the church in worship without the kids. Roger Nishioka, a good friend of mine, the thing that comes out of his mouth more than anything else that I remember is he constantly says that our faith is communally constructed. That means we come to faith, we grow in faith, we learn about faith, we experience faith when we interact with one another, when we rub shoulders with one another, all ages being present together, sharing faith stories with one another, experiencing worship together with one another. And so the only way our children can grow in faith is when they're in community with us. And so we need to be in worship together. The Sunday school movement put an emphasis on children receiving cognitive education in age and stage classrooms based on what developmental theorists told us we ought to be doing. John Westerhoff reminds us that what we cut out of that entire conversation was the Bible, and what the Bible tells us what we should be doing. We should be gathering together and worshiping together, that all of us need to be together for transformational ministry. Our children have an incredible capacity to reflect, to experience, to be deeply spiritual, and worship is the place where they can do that best of all. They are innately spiritual when they come into our world, and we invite them into the space that we worship. So, how do we do intergenerational worship? I'm not going to talk so much about what happens in worship at this moment, but I want to talk about how we prepare for intergenerational worship first. This was the thing I had to work with congregations first when they decided to make this transition. The first thing we need to do is we need to help our children be intentionally prepared for intergenerational worship. I have to start this by saying in my Sunday schools, the ones that I'm used to, the ones in my denomination, I don't know about your Sunday schools, children are constantly told by their Sunday school teachers that they are so lucky that they get to go to Sunday school. They get to play. They get to run around. They get to do all sorts of interesting things. They are so lucky that they get to go to Sunday school and not have to go to worship, because worship is boring and you have to sit. And then when they hit grade 6, we say to our children, you are so lucky. You get to go to worship now. You get to be with everyone else. And the children are going, wait a minute. You told me that worship is boring. You told me that Sunday school was great. I don't want to go to worship. We need to intentionally prepare our children for worship, to transition from Sunday school, whether that's in grade 1, grade 3, grade 5. We need to intentionally prepare our children for worship so they're not going to a strange land, a foreign land, but in fact help give them the language of worship, teach them what's happening in worship so that it's not a strange place. So we need to have workshops with our kids, playing around in the sanctuary, diving under the communion table, playing with the microphone, climbing over the pews, climbing under the pews, sliding under the pews. Times and opportunities to learn the various different parts of worship, the prayers, the creeds, the rituals, all of those things that we do. And then worship needs to be intentionally prepared for all ages, so that everything that happens in worship takes every age into consideration. Most of our worship services are actually prepared For people of a working age, we don't even take older people into consideration, and that's usually our biggest population. We pick hymns that are best for people in middle ages that can sing those songs. They're often very difficult for our older people to sing at that pitch. All of our prayers of confession are by and large for people who are confessing things that are out and about in the world. What about people in care facilities and such? What about children who are on the schoolyard and have ruckuses on the schoolyard, and what we might want a prayer of confession to be in that kind of a context? So we need to make sure that if all ages are present, every single aspect of worship is prepared with them in mind. And the best way to do that is actually to begin to put children and youth on your worship committees, to ask them questions about what they like in worship, what they experience in worship, what they understand in worship, what they don't understand in worship. You may have children on for short terms. The worship services we're preparing for Lent, or the worship services we're preparing for the summer, because being on a worship committee for a 3-year term for a 7-year-old is a bit much. But to have them there and to listen well and to hear what's important to them. I remember a child on a worship service or on a worship committee that was so upset about the removal of an incredibly traditional verse that we would sing when we gathered every single Sunday. And we took it out because we thought the children hated it. It was ritual. It was tradition. They loved it. We had to put it back. And so worship needs to be intentionally prepared for all ages. And other ways of doing this is to take into consideration a multi-sensory environment for children. It's actually really good for everybody, not just for the kids. But to take into consideration a multi-sensory environment. What do they smell in your church? What do they see in your church? What do they touch in your church? What do they taste in your church in worship? Begin to think about those. And experiential worship. The thing that connects with children in intergenerational worship more than any other thing are rituals. Children are well tuned for rituals. They love the repetition and they love the visual parts of that. They love being participants in the rituals of worship, lighting a Christ candle as worship begins, asking questions before communion as to why it is that we do this thing and what it is that we're going about when we do this thing that we're doing. The rituals of baptism, being very involved in the rituals of baptism and communion, and any other rituals that you can imagine to bring into your church. Experiential worship is important for them. Children like repetition, they like silence, they like wonder, they like awe, they like mystery. Children also like music. They connect well with music in worship. Congregations also need to be intentionally prepared for children being in intergenerational worship. You will hear complaints that you're going to dumb down the service, and I don't want to come anymore. You'll hear from parents who say, I have to sit beside my child every week. And so our congregations need to know the why. And that's why I focus a lot on the why it is so important for children. I find congregations are more than happy to buy in when they know why they're buying in, not just what they're buying into. So I spend a lot more time talking about why. And so I do workshops with congregations as well, answering questions and preparing them for what it's going to look like and what it's not going to look like. The other thing I say to congregations is to begin incrementally. Don't be going and putting it all in at once. Oh, guess what? Cold turkey, next week, intergenerational worship. That's it. That's where we're going for the rest of our lives. Although I did work with a congregation who said that, and they did. But to begin incrementally, how do you make intergenerational worship in that 15 minutes before the kids go downstairs? What do you do to the worship service then? What do you change the prayers to be? How do you pick the songs? What is it that you're going to do then? And then begin to build on that. Or do intergenerational worship seasonally and begin to do that. I want to tell you a couple of stories. One is from one of the churches that I worked with in looking at these 6 best practices. It was a 2-point charge, and 2 of the things that they did when they decided to go to intergenerational worship is the children, first of all, decided that they wanted instruments in worship. And so they created in the Sunday school the instruments that would be used in worship, and they passed them out to all the adults to be used in worship. That went well. And some of the adults were great, and they would play all these instruments in the first hymns, and they would have a great time, some not so much, but they just persisted, and it kept happening. The other thing that I wanted to say in this particular 2-point charge is the children said that they wanted to learn how to take up the offering. And so they decided to go through this process where any of the kids who wanted to learn to take up the offering were going to be partnered with an usher who also took up the offering. And for a 3-week period, every week, they would go to the back with their usher and they would be paired, and they would have the same usher every week, and they would go with the usher and take up the offering. The usher was the one with the plate, would go down, and all that process of going back and forth between the various different pews and such. And they did this for 3 weeks, and the kids went to the front with them when they took the offering plates and the prayer was said, and then they would hand them to the minister to go on the communion table, and then they would head back out. 3 weeks, the next 3 weeks, the children had the offering plate, and the ushers went alongside with them. And so the usher never touched the plate. The kids did everything. The kids took the plates to the front, stood, bowed their heads when the prayer was said, handed the plate to the minister. And it was noted that the children were actually more respectful in that prayer portion. And then the 6-week period was over. Okay, kids, you can take up the offering now. And the kids said no, they didn't want to. They wanted to stick with their usher. They wanted to take up offering from now on with their usher because they were their friend. And in that church, children are paired with adults to take up the offering now 5 years later. And they continue to do that. And that was one of the things that they loved. Next one. That's the one I talk about the most, so you're safe. You will get out of here on time. I just put all the kids into your worship service, and if you're anything like mine, your children go down to Sunday school during worship, so now you're going to say, so what are we going to do with the Sunday school? What are we going to do with the Sunday school? And so in the Sunday school, we want to consider new models for church school, and I just want to tell you some of the ones that I've discovered that churches who are doing intergenerational worship are now doing as Sunday school. It's okay still to have age and stage education opportunities, but not during worship, because that's the most important thing that we do. And so I have some churches that are doing contemplative models of Sunday school, so they're doing young children in worship or godly play, and they're stopping at about grade 1. But what they're also doing is they're paying particular attention to how they're preparing children in young children in worship for worship. And then they're also carrying many of the items of young children in worship into intergenerational worship as well. And so as the children transition from one to the other, there are familiar things for them. The figures are used in worship. The stories are read as scripture in worship. There's activities from young children in worship or from godly play that they also carry on for all ages in worship. So what is familiar in one place is familiar in the other. I have another church that's doing online homeschool Sunday school. This one I think is fascinating. It's a lectionary-based church, and so what happens in this church is they're buying Sunday school curriculum. They're revising the Sunday school curriculum so that it's appropriate for parents to be able to work with their children at home. It's lectionary based. And so what happens is at the beginning of the week, every family is emailed Sunday school curriculum. It's broadly graded, so you don't have to teach 4 different lesson plans if you have 4 kids. And they do it as a family together. And then partway through the week, they send all their questions to the minister for the sermon. And then when worship comes along, the minister is often saying things like, I heard from so-and-so that you wonder about. Let's think about that for a minute. And so they hear their own questions and stories responded to in the sermon time, in worship. I have another church that has moved to a midweek program. They already had a midweek program, a Logos program. There are many midweek programs that happen during the week. And they have always seen their midweek program as digging deeper and on top of Sunday school. And they've decided to get rid of their Sunday school, and their midweek program is now their age and stage program. And so Logos is now their primary curriculum and their primary age and stage teaching. And there are a number of other ones that also provide those kinds of materials. I have some churches that are doing seasonal and intergenerational events. So rather than having a Sunday school, they have a day on a Saturday. The whole community is invited. They've actually increased their number of kids because all the kids from all the other churches show up as well. And what they do is they do kind of like a 4-hour special, 2 hours lunch, another hour. And they take all the time they would have put into Sunday school on a Sunday by Sunday basis, and they do it all once a month or once every 6 weeks or for each season of the church year. And they have a great sort of VBS feeling kind of experience, and that's how they're doing Sunday school now. I have another church that's doing project-based learning, and what that means is intergenerationally, they're gathering people together who are concerned about something. They might be concerned about poverty in their community. They might be concerned about great new music for their church. Whatever it is, regardless of age, they come together and they work on that midweek over a number of weeks, and then they come back and that group does the entire service of worship and shares with the church what they've learned as they've gone out into the community to look at the food bank, as they've gone out into the community and done a number of other things. I have another church. This one is interesting. They have a family-based program for non-attending generations. In their church, they have a lot of grandparents. And a lot of grandparents are very sad because their adult children are not interested in coming to church. Therefore, their grandchildren are not coming to church. And so they've created a Sunday evening program for multi-generations for them, their children, and their grandchildren to come to church on Sunday nights. They've based it on a messy church kind of Logos model. They built their own kind of thing out of it. They come together for a meal. They do all sorts of study and research together. They do activities together. They worship together. And the adult children haven't noticed that it's church yet. Because they're spending time with their children and the grandparents, and they're happy that they're spending time together. The church raised the question of if they're not there on Sunday morning, is it still church? The answer came back, yes, it's still church. And so it continues in that church. And then I have another church that does intergenerational small groups. And they meet in homes over meals during the week. Some of them are once a week, some of them are once a month. And they study together. And the children are involved in the meal, and they're involved in the conversation, and they're involved in everything that is going on. And sometimes there are extra things there, Play-Doh or coloring sheets that they can also be engaged with, but it is deliberately intergenerational so that all ages are a part of those conversations in that study. So new models for church school. To support and resource parents for the unique role they have in the spiritual formation of their children. Barna says that 85% of parents of children between the ages of 0 and 12 believe they ought to have the primary responsibility for the faith formation of their children. Yet most of these parents say in the average week, they do absolutely nothing. Before we beat up these parents, and then they say, because we don't know how. When we as a church moved to age and stage education after the Second World War and into the baby boom, we often said to our parents, bring us your children to church. We will teach them everything they need to know. And parents took us at our word. And so we're 4 generations or more since those days. And with each generation, less and less and less is happening in homes. By the time we reach this generation, they are validly saying, we don't know how to talk about faith at home. And so we need to support and resource our parents for doing things and talking about and experiencing faith at home. COVID for me was actually, in some ways, great fun because all of a sudden we turned to supporting and resourcing parents to do this at home, sending home children's Bible storybooks and sending home activities that they could do. And even then, when COVID came to a close, I'm not sure if it was the parents or the church who basically said, okay, we're back to the way it used to be. You're off the hook again, parents. Our parents need to know how to talk about faith at home, to read Bible stories at home, to talk and wonder about those stories together as a family, to pray together, to just talk about what happened at the schoolyard that afternoon in a faithful context, to weave faith in and through everything that they do. And so we need to resource our parents with all sorts of things like children's family Bibles, those wonderful family sheets that come with curriculum when you send those kids home, to actually send those home, or even better, email them home so they don't end up in the trash in the coffee hour. And to begin to support parents, to have workshops for parents so that they will learn those things, and even better, have intergenerational events where we come together, we look at something together, we have a great time together, we actually do some activities together, and then we send them home with those resources so that they can continue to do them at home. We don't just make an Advent wreath, we do an Advent devotion from an Advent devotional booklet while we're there, and then we send the booklet home. We are pretty much guaranteed that the children in that family will pester their parents for at least 5 to 7 days that you told them that they were supposed to do this, and so they'll bug their parents to make sure that they do this. So support and resource our parents. 5 key practices for faith at home from Holly Catterton Allen, from how parents nurture the spiritual development of their children, are, number 1, to participate in religious activities and rituals at home. Send home Advent wreaths. Send home Christ candles for the dinner table. Encourage them to come up with family rituals of their own. I love to tell this story in our family. If it's worth doing, it's worth overdoing. That's pretty much my family motto. And so there was one year I brought home a Christmas tree that was so big, it hit all 4 walls of the dining room, and we had to cut 2 feet off for it to get underneath the ceiling. It was a really pretty tree. And so we decorated the tree, and I don't know how you decorate the tree. In our house, we decorate the tree by the first thing you do is you have to put all the lights on, and then you turn off the lights in the room to make sure there's balance on all the lights in the room. And so what happened when we turned all the lights off in the room, our daughter Miriam, who was probably about 3 or 4 years old at the time, dove underneath the Christmas tree, laid on her back, and looked up through the lights of the Christmas tree. And then she invited us all. We all had to climb underneath there, lay underneath, look at the lights underneath the Christmas tree. And then my daughter said, she is a preacher's kid, I apologize for this. She said, "What is the thing that you are looking most forward to when Jesus comes as the light of the world?" That's a preacher's kid. And we had that conversation underneath that Christmas tree. We got out, we decorated the tree, life went on. Next Christmas, Miriam dives under the tree. What is the thing you're most looking forward to when Jesus comes as the light of the world? Not a ritual that we planned, not something that the church decided we had to do, nothing that is a ritual that you see at church, but it became a family ritual for us. And my daughter is 31 years old, and we still lie under the Christmas tree every Christmas once the lights are on, because that's our family ritual. They have incredible staying power. Even when they're teenagers and they say they don't want to do it, it has incredible staying power. So family activities, whether it's Friday is pizza night and we play board games together, whether it's what you say when the kids go out the door every single day when they go out the door, be kind. Whatever it is that you do in your families, some will stick, some won't stick, pick them and carry on with them. To foster everyday conversation. So rather than talking about, oh, Jesus time, let's stop and let's read the Bible and let's do that, but to foster everyday conversations in and through all of the activities of our lives. Deuteronomy 6, when you lie down, when you stand up, when you're in the marketplace, when you're in your home, when you're off at work, any time and in any place, we have conversations about faith. Third one is to model a congruent lifestyle, which means those first two are completely eliminated if what we do has nothing to do with what we say. Model a congruent lifestyle. An authoritative model of parenting. There are 4 different primary models of parenting. An authoritative model of parenting, which has nothing to do with faith whatsoever, is the one that is most likely for children to grow up in faith and to become adults of faith. And to join an intentional intergenerational faith community, to get support, to be a part of a community of faith, but one that is intentionally intergenerational, that knows your children's names, that welcomes them when they come, asks them what happened at the T-ball game last week, or how that paper that they were concerned about, ask them about those kinds of things. To support and resource our parents for the unique role they have. I keep telling Christian education committees, you need to be doing 50% of your time when you're in committee meetings worrying about this and not the Sunday school. To share our stories of faith with each other as a part of God's big story. I started by saying that I'm Canadian and I'm Presbyterian, which basically means that we don't talk about anything. We are more than happy to tell biblical stories to our children. We're more than happy to read those Bible stories out of Bible storybooks. But don't ask us to talk about our faith, our experience of God, what is important to us, to our children. So this may just be a Canadian slide, but I'm going to tell you about it anyway. We need to share our stories of faith with our children, because our children, while they come into the world spiritually connected from birth, they're aware of this greater other. They adopt their faith through the people that they know and love best of all. That's how children come to faith. They know you. They know the older gentleman that they sit beside in the pew in church on a Sunday morning. The person who gives them a peppermint on the way up the stairs into the Sunday school or into the worship service. The person who makes sure that they're okay and takes note of what's going on in their lives. These are the people that children learn about and adopt faith from more than anything else. Those Bible stories that we tell them, they're very, very meaningful, but it's your stories and the stories of everyone else in your congregation that matter more than anything. Why do they pray? Why do they come to church? What's most meaningful to them? What has been an amazing moment in their lives when they felt Jesus closer than you can imagine? And what have been trying times? We have to encourage all of the adults and everyone else, the children and the youth as well, to talk about their stories of faith with each other. Now, the other part of this is as a part of God's big story. Our children get the idea that by the time we hit the book of Revelation, the story is done. We shut the book. Our stories don't matter. Our stories matter a lot. Our stories are incredibly important, but we need to tell our stories within the context of God's big story. This is God's continuing action in our world and in our church and in our family and in our communities. There's a woman, Sharon Walkerton Short, and she did this incredible study, and it is called The Story That Grew, the meta-narrative of Scripture. And she looked at Scripture and went through the whole honkin' thing and basically noticed that there are particular times in Scripture where the people sit down and they tell the entire story. They go all the way back to the beginning, and they talk about creation. And then they talk about Noah's Ark. They talk about Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And they talk about everything that happened that led them up to that moment in time. And then they add on the story that they are living right now. It happens at times when things are changing. It happens at times when things need to change. And so she notices this all the way through the Hebrew scriptures and even into the New Testament. She talks about Stephen. When Stephen was arrested and he was in front of the court and he was asked, "Why did you do what did you do?" And Stephen didn't answer that question. He went back to the beginning and he told the whole story. And he told the story of why it is that where he is right now is a part of God's big story. And so when our children hear that we're all a part of that story, it matters. It matters greatly. I put this picture up here. I just want to show it to you. This is a story of a fire that happened in a community that's a part of my synod. If you pretty much know where Santa lives, this is just a few miles south. Where Santa lives. This is a community called Haley, and it's in Temiskaming Presbytery, which is 10 hours north of Toronto, where I live, and it's one of my churches. In 1922, there was a fire in Haley. And with that fire, what happened was they put all the women into the lake. It was on the side of a lake. All of the women went into the lake. The men passed all the children into the arms of the women in the lake. And when all of the children and all of the women were in the lake, the men then went and stood in the lake. And they watched their entire town burn to the ground. And not one person was lost. Now, if you go to see this statue in Haley, Ontario, you will see a big, huge story right beside this statue. And they've tied it in to God's creation. To Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, to Stephen, to the community of Haley, when God changed their lives and cared for each and every one of them. We need to tell these stories as a part of God's big story so that our children and our whole church knows that we are a part of that story. We're not an addendum. We're right in there. To involve children in service projects and acts of justice. Here's a statistic for you. Involvement in service projects is a better predictor of faith maturity than participation in Sunday school, Bible study, or worship. Involvement in service projects is the most transformative thing that we all, including children, can do. Some of this information comes out of David Chinosh in the book that he wrote with Ivy Beckwith. And David Chinosh's history is actually, he's Mennonite, so he's very involved in service projects. And he points out a number of things. First of all, our churches need to make the needs of children their greatest priority in the selection of the mission projects and service projects that they do. They need to do that for a few reasons. Number one, so that our children know that we care about children. But number two is because our children in every single way are often the ones who are the most vulnerable, the highest generational group in any kind of crisis. 40% of children are the ones who go to food banks. There are more children in refugee camps than anywhere else. Children are the ones who are harmed the most in war, and children have no say in any of this. And so our children need to see that we care for children, and we do need to care for children. And so we need to make them our greatest priority, and we need to involve our children in those acts of service. So we need to be paying particular attention to what children can and can't be involved in. My church did a Habitat for Humanity project. Children are not allowed on the site. We're still very supportive of Habitat for Humanity, but we will not do it anymore. I'm sorry, to Habitat for Humanity. We worked out ways that our children could be involved at our church itself, but we are picking projects that children can be involved in. Children are allowed to go into food banks and help sort food. Children are allowed to be involved in places that serve meals to people who are experiencing homelessness. Children, in this case, it's all generations that made this community garden in one of my churches. And this community garden is open to the entire community to come and pick whatever they want, whenever they want. And the rest of it all goes down to a food bank. But other than that, it's planted by all ages, it's maintained by all ages. The other thing that the church does with this that I love is children go into it on a Sunday morning and take out bits and bobs of all sorts of things in this garden, and they give it to the people in our congregation who are living alone, who feel like they can't buy fruits and vegetables at the grocery store because their bags are just way too big, and you can't get through that head of lettuce or that bag of oranges. And we don't have oranges in Canada, but anyway. So children need to do it, and which also means start with small projects. Don't get yourself caught in something that goes on for years. Children connect much better in small projects with a limited time. They need to be involved in the decisions for those projects, what's going to happen with that project. They need to be participants in the project, and they need to be participants in the evaluation and the conversation and the understandings that happen after that project. This is my last one. You do get out of here. What time am I supposed to let you out of here? Oh, crumbs, we can talk about so many things. Okay, so this is my last one, and it's kind of silly sounding. It's make intentionally intergenerational the default position of your church. Most of our churches, generationally, or I guess make intentionally age and stage, is the default position of our church. We assume everything that happens in our church is basically going to be in age and stage groups, unless for some reason we say, oh, that would be lovely intergenerational, let's go ahead and do that. This is just flipping that on its head. Assume everything that you do in the church is going to be intergenerational, and there's no reason why things can't be generationally grouped, but that is something that is reasoned the other way. Oh, this is something that ought to be for one generational group or one other kind of specific group. So to make intentionally intergenerational the default position of your church. And when we think about intergenerational, I want to again point out that intergenerational is not simply all ages in one space at one time doing individual things and not talking with one another or relating with one another, but it's actually the conversation and the possibilities of faithful conversations across the tables together. I talk about at the church that I worship at, oh please, this is going on film. The church that I worship at, when we generally have a potluck supper, there's 3 tables that run down the length of our fellowship hall. And all the children sit on one table in that fellowship hall. All the older people sit on another table on the opposite side of the fellowship hall, trying to figure out if they can get to the dessert table before the kids get to the dessert table. And thrilled to bits that all the parents are on the middle table down the middle of that fellowship hall as kind of a barricade, saving them from any kind of tragedy that might happen if those kids cross over to the other side. And so they call that an intergenerational meal. It's advertised as an intergenerational meal. It's not. It's a potluck supper. And everybody talks in their own intergenerational groups, hoping they'll get to the dessert table before anyone else. And so in this church, we've had to change that. We've had to put out round tables. We've had to play games that they have no idea mean that they're going to land on the table with the last group they're stuck with in that game. And then they have things that they have to talk about at that table, so that we've moved to intergenerational potluck suppers. And they complained a lot. And we kept doing it until they stopped complaining, and it worked. And so we need to create all sorts of opportunities for people to share their stories with one another, to naturally form relationships across generations with one another, to learn each other's names and what's important to each other in our church together. So we need to use intergenerational as our default position. Now, you've heard the word intergenerational a lot, and I'm assuming you didn't come in here to learn about intergenerational. And I didn't think when I was looking at all of this that intergenerational was primarily going to be the answer for most of what I was thinking about. Most of our churches with very few children, intergenerational is what they already are. But they're not intentional about it, and they're not taking advantage of it. So it's not so much changing them as much it is teaching how it is we become more intentional in our relationships with one another, how we connect with the children in our church, how we welcome them into our church. So where do we go from here? When I did this as a piece of research in my synod, I approached a number of churches and I asked them to pick one. Just pick one practice, and work with it for a year. Call it an experiment so everybody who said they didn't want to change anything knows it could go back. But try one thing for 1 year. Be aware of the other stuff. Start with the low-hanging fruit. I said start with the first part of worship. Make that intergenerational. Carry on with your pattern, but be more intentional about what happens in worship before the kids go down, and then keep adding it. Try one mission project and see where that takes you. But to begin to find some low-hanging fruit and just take advantage of that. One of the ministers that I worked with on this, his low-hanging fruit was to change worship at his end and not even let the church know about it. He just started changing the language. He started changing the number of times people stood up and sat down, the hymns that were being picked, the activities that were being done. Eventually he got to the point that the children's story and the sermon became two equal-sized pieces in worship. And in what we would traditionally think of as the children's story, he talked a lot about what was going to happen in the sermon for the kids to pick up on that. And he gave them things to manipulate or to work with, to look for in that. And then, in what we would traditionally call the sermon, he made lots and lots of references to what was going on in the children's story. So you needed to actually pay attention to both. Try and find the low-hanging fruit and begin to do it. Look at what you're already doing and tweak it. The caution that I have in my experience with my churches, and I can tell you many stories of the experiences that I had with my churches, is you are going to pay way more attention to the why. You are going to talk about this way more than you think you will ever need to talk about anything again in your life. And they haven't figured this out yet. They haven't heard this yet. You're going to need to pay attention to the front end of this. And then the train is just going to have to leave the station, and you're going to get on with it. I have lots of stories from some of the churches that I worked with this, some of the ways we did some of these practices. But at this point, I'd love to hear if there's any questions, any concerns, whether you want a half-hour break, anything.
Tori, I have one online. Haley shares that we tried a playground in worship, but it was too distracting, and so they had to let it go.
Okay. So the question, if you didn't hear it, is that in Haley's church, they tried a prayer ground, and that's basically usually it's a table, and it's usually, if you're really good about it, at the front of the sanctuary, kind of right underneath the pulpit, and there's usually activities and things to do. And then they said it was a little too loud and noisy. Too distracting, and so they let it go. I know some churches that all have them in the back as well. So now you're just going to hear more about what I think about prayer grounds. So I actually think that in some contexts, prayer grounds are absolutely great. But I put a lot of provisos on prayer grounds. There are a number of churches that have prayer grounds that the kids run to the front. Their Sunday school teachers, usually there's one or two are sitting on the table. There's lots of activities. There's coloring sheets. There's all sorts of stuff to do on that. And the kids sit at that table. Haley can tell me whether or not this is true for her experience. The kids sit at that table by and large for all of the worship service, often even before worship even begins. And then when it's all said and done, they come back. Some prayer grounds, and I don't want to be critical here, but I'm going to go ahead, is that it's actually activities to keep the kids distracted so that they're not disturbing in worship of the adults who really are not fond of having them there. So the prayer grounds that I work with, often children are not allowed to go to the prayer ground until the sermon time. And in other churches I work with, they're more given like a brown paper bag with certain things at it that they take back to the pew while they're sitting with their parents. But if you do have a prayer ground at the front, you have a Sunday school teacher or two sitting there. But I work very, very closely with the minister in my church for this. And we do a lot of conversation about the sermon and what is happening in the sermon. The sermon is that great thing that we have to figure out how we're going to do with children. And so we talk about the sermon together, and we begin to devise things that the children might be engaged with the sermon in. And so often what happens is the children are invited when it's time for the sermon to begin, not even when the scripture's read. That's done first. They're often invited to come and sit at that table. And at that table, before anything starts with the sermon, the minister will say something like, "Today in the sermon, we're going to be talking about the prodigal son. And in this story, there are many, many people. You're going to see on that prayer ground table, they're like tongue depressors that have these little people shapes on them. And I'm going to ask you to color those individual people. There's lots of them on the table. I'm going to ask you to color them to represent the different people that were involved in the story of the prodigal son. And I'm going to ask you to draw their faces and how they were feeling in that story. And when I get to the sermon, in the sermon, to that person, I want you to hold up that person and show that to me, or I want you to do something with that, and we'll actually stop the sermon and have a conversation with the kids at the table. Sometimes the things that they do might be Play-Doh, where they're asked to make something that they're thankful for, and to listen carefully for the 3 things that the minister talked about that we're thankful for. And so it's all about building a relationship between the kids and what is happening in the sermon, not to distract them from the sermon, but to actually engage them with it, but to give them other things to do that is multisensory. And then when the sermon is over, they are then asked to go back to sit with their parents. Everything else that happens in worship can be incredibly engaging for them. I ask families to sit towards the front, but the ups and the downs and the singing and the words of the prayers, all of those things are things that basically children of all ages can be engaged with and easily engaged with if we've been planning well. The sermon is the difficult part. And so sometimes it's bags that they take back to their pew, and they're given instruction from the pulpit or in the children's story for what it is that they're going to be doing in those bags. I want to talk about a couple of other sermon things that I've seen. I have one minister that breaks it out in 3 5-minute bits, and so it's broken up. One minister, it was just absolutely fantastic. The one day she told everybody who was under the age of 20 to get up and go sit beside someone who was over the age of 20. And then she assigned a conversation that they should have. In the middle of the sermon, we stopped, we had a conversation. And then she asked each of the groups a response, shout out what it was you talked about or whatever. And then she said, feel free to go back and sit with your parents. And at least half the kids didn't. They stayed with the person they were with. And honestly, watching the person they were with pull out the hymn book and follow along with their finger the words leaning down in the hymn that happened after that sermon, or leaning down and explaining. So I would suggest to Haley, try again, and it might not be a table at the front, but to me, when we engage children in worship and we give them things to do, they have to be activities that draw them into worship and help them in worship than to distract us from worship. Haley can answer that if she wants. Any other questions? Yes,
A little bit different, but when we were sitting here talking, and in the context of Sunday school, overwhelmingly we all, from post-COVID, our numbers of families who have come back have been few.
Right.
So if you're not a church that so much would be doing intergenerational like Sunday school, but are still doing the model, you know, or some variation of that, how do we keep dwelling on trying to get them back, or do we just do we send home the at-home teaching faith to your children? I mean,
Yes.
what do
you
we
do
do?
it all.
What do we do?
When I'm talking with my churches right now, I'm just going to go on sidelines here. When I'm talking with my churches right now, the first thing I'm doing is I'm telling them to make connections with the people that they haven't seen. Many of our churches just assumed everyone was okay. When COVID hit, we paid an incredible amount of attention to putting worship online, and we paid an incredible amount of attention to our older people who were living alone. And so if you think you lost your families during COVID, you lost them in the first 6 weeks. And we often never called them to check in on them. So first thing you need to do is you need to call them to check in on them. You're not calling them to invite them back to Sunday school. You're certainly not calling them to be a Sunday school teacher, but you're calling to actually ask how they are. And it needs to be a phone call, not an email and not a cute letter. It needs to be a one-on-one phone call. And we in our Christian Education Committee divided ourselves all out and put names out and who's calling who and stuff like that. And actually I did this with another church, and then I had a meeting afterwards about what they were going to do. And all the responses that they got from the people completely changed what they were going to do. So as well as asking how there are, you may want to ask, what connected with you? What didn't connect with you? What do you miss? What do you never need to see ever again? And what do you need from us? So those are the questions I asked them to ask. Another thing that happened when we came back is often what happened is our churches immediately dropped Zoom Sunday school. They went back to just Sunday school, and whoever came, they're the winners. Whoever didn't come, sorry, too bad, so sad. And so a number of my churches just like gave up Zoom Sunday school immediately. And so we have children who are gone. And so I would encourage you to think in multiple platforms and multiple ways. If we still have, at least in my area in Canada, we still have people who are not willing to come back to church yet. My church is still mask wearing. Everybody wears masks. We have very few hymns, and so I think it's worth talking about Zoom Sunday School again, and it may be broadly graded Zoom Sunday School, and it may be an occasional time, find out what your people want, but I think we do need to do that. And one of the things that I think about often, who here watched the APCE event that was completely online 2 years ago? Bruce Reyes-Chow in that said that our churches need to be hybrid from now forever, that this is not just something we're doing for the short term. And then he talked about ways in which we actually do literally make it hybrid in ways that everybody feel like they are in the first class of our church, whether they're actually sitting in a pew or not. And I think we have to really talk about that with our children as well. How is it that we begin to think about our church as hybrid going forward? Ideally, we want people in community, and we want those relationships because that's what makes faith transformative. But we still need to begin to consider, what does hybrid ministry with children look like? Does it look like something that happens on another day of the week? Does it look like something that happens over Zoom? Does it look like, I have some Sunday school teachers working with the Zoom screen in the Sunday school class as well, and they're adapting lessons to be able to do things on a screen and in a classroom at the same time. But also, so what does hybrid children's ministry look like? And begin to just experiment with it. We may find that our children are willing to come back, or at least their families, because it has to do with their parents, are willing to come back for special occasions, or they're willing to come back for an outdoor summer ministry program because they're outdoors and they're not at risk in the church. We may also learn, as this one church that I worked with learned, is that some of them had moved on to other churches, and we just have to say, go with God. I'm glad you're in another space that meets your needs. It's going to be a slow process. But I think the biggest thing is to stay in connection with our children and our parents. One of the things that I did in COVID, early on in COVID, is I started calling families. Ministers gave me families information that were willing to talk to me all around my synod, and I asked them about their experience. And then began to talk then to churches about what it is that they need to do given the experiences of these families. And I think the biggest thing we don't do is ask our families what they want. Any other questions or thoughts or concerns? Yes, please.
And we do a lot of what you've already suggested with the intergenerational things, and some of it we do really well. We still want to continue to stress it just because we still feel that there is a little bit of a disconnect. And we had a couple of our aging members who said, well, intergenerational is great, but it seems to be all about the kids.
Right.
And so how do you counter that to make them more open to the fact that it's about all of us. It's about them. It's about the things that we find that they have a value that can be shared with these children to increase their faith formation, when they feel like what we're doing is focusing on the children and not on them.
Right. And I agree with you, and I've had that experience as well. Do they hear online the questions that the people, do I need to repeat the question?
You can, just to be safe, I'm not 100% sure.
Okay. I don't want to so the question is older people who feel like the emphasis is all on children and begin to feel left out. Is that a fair way of just putting it? And so I'll go back to that thing about the why, and if they understand why we're doing what we're doing. But I'll also say, when it comes to, let's just pick on intergenerational worship for a bit. When we do intergenerational worship, the other thing that we need to keep in mind is it's not all, balloons and confetti bombs. Because what we're actually trying to do is create worship that is welcoming to all ages, and is also the worship that we anticipate they will experience when they're grown up. And so it's not all confetti bombs and balloons. I mean, certainly I think opportunities for conversation, opportunities for rituals, and a confetti bomb every once in a while is okay. But mostly what we're trying to do is we're trying to do worship that takes all ages into consideration. And so I'm not a massive advocate of kind of the crazy over-the-top stuff. And there are times and places that it's absolutely important. Also, engaging those older people in the relationships with kids, in the activity of the day. One of the things that I also talk a lot about is not to, okay, today the kids are reading scripture, okay, today the kids are taking up the offering or whatever it is, but to actually be having them working with adults and such, and so that an adult who works with kids doing scripture, and one, they're standing there together and so on and so forth, it begins to build compassion and empathy for all of the ages across the board, and learning that maybe that child needs to help that older person a little bit with the stairs, that kind of thing. And so it's really about building those relationships. Any other questions?
We have one online.
Okay, thank you.
So Rebecca says, my children are 2 of the 3 youth who regularly attend. How do I help people take my children seriously? Wanting them to be included and not age and stage when it seems like they're the only ones.
At the church.
Yeah.
So, but they're teens.
She says youth.
Youth, okay. So the question was about the 2 children of this one person. 2 out of the 3 youth, Rebecca's 2 kids, are not, how do you help the adults of the church relate to their kids so that they're included and feel a part of it? In one sense, there are programs that create opportunities for people to be matched up, secret friends and so on and so forth. I honestly, they have their place, But the relationships that are formed that are far more natural relationships are the more important relationships and the long-lasting relationships. And sometimes you find 2 or 3 of the pairs in a prayer partnership kind of a thing will take, and the others just kind of disappear at the end of the year. I think it is fair as a parent to go to somebody that you think your child would connect well with and just say, it is important to me that my child have a friend in this church beyond me. Would you please talk to them in coffee hour? Find out what's going on in their lives. I've had some adults in my church that I have basically made a promise that they will talk to 2 children or youth before they talk to any adult in the coffee hour, and that's a promise that they've made. I think it's okay to do that. I think it's also okay to even say, who in the church do you think you might be interested in having a chat with, and picking that person off as well. But I do think that the more natural relationships are the important ones. But I think then there's the other stuff. There's the stuff where you go to the minister, or you go to the whoever's writing the newsletter article, or you go to the Christian Education Committee or whatever, and you make sure those kinds of things are preached about, the importance of relationships across the generations, and this is how our children come to faith, and this is how our youth come to faith. It's important that that be preached. It's important that that be put in, the bulletin or in the pew cards, or any and every way avenue possible. I think it's important to remind the church about these relationships. I have a friend, and this is little kids. The kids in her Sunday school all go into worship in grade 1. They're in Sunday school up until grade 1. Grade 1, they're now going into Sunday school. And she goes into the sanctuary before they come in. They all get marched in, I guess, from the Sunday school at the end of this thing. And she goes into the sanctuary and she says, our grade 1 students are coming to worship today. They're going to be with us now for the rest of their worshiping lives. And so this is what you're going to do. And she talks about, they look at you to learn how to worship. They look to you to become worshipers of God. Hold down that hymn book, whisper to them in church and help them along. Tell them that you're so glad that they're here. You are the ones who are teaching these children how to worship. They're coming in, and then she opens the door, and they're invited to sit anywhere they want. And everybody gets that responsibility. Any other concerns or questions? It's been a long time, I know. Yes?
I think to remind the congregation that they're fulfilling their baptismal vows that they take when the child is baptized.
Yeah.
That they've already promised to do this.
I know.
But to maybe help them to see how to do it.
If you can preach that in a positive way as opposed to a guilt trip. Right. We're starting to pack up. Is that right? If you have any questions, there's my email. If you have any questions or you want to stay and ask me any questions, I'm here if there's anything you'd like to chat about. Thank you very much. I know this was the last one of the day, and I know it's a hot room. Thank you so much.